Hello and welcome along to this video. My name is Terry Lee Shield. I am host of Love School, and I've been sharing a lot of content lately around inner heal. I have been sharing a lot of content lately around inner child healing and reparenting. And what came to me the other night as a little spark of inspiration was how the archetypes that are represented in the story of Peter Pan and the film of Hook, how relevant they are to just illustrate the consequences of not doing inner child work and reparenting. And I wanted to just do a little video about it. Now, I haven't planned this. If we decide that it needs a little bit more structure and a proper plan and a bit more of a detailed explanation, I will reshoot it. But for now, I just want to kind of talk about some of the characters, the archetypes in there, some of the themes of the story, so that, well, one, it's just a bit interesting, isn't it? But it might be helpful for you in your understanding of inner child work, reparenting work, and why it's important. And it might just help just to give more body to these words that we often use. One of the things I have talked about is the rules of parenting, the rules of creation in regard to these archetypes involved in life, reproduction, raising children, inner child wounds, and the reparenting process. And those archetypes are the mother, the father, and the child. They are representative of the energy requirements of masculine, feminine, and growth for creation. And to go a little bit deeper into all that, Peter Pan does this quite well. So if you don't know who Peter Pan is, please do a search. Watch Peter Pan. There's I've watched it again recently. There's the Peter Pan Disney movie, and it's what I watched, and I also watched Hook, which is basically a newer, I say newer, it's very old now. It's around when I was a kid, so 20 or 30 years or whatever, years ago or whatever. But the story of Peter Pan is the boy that never wanted to grow up. Okay, he's the boy who lives in Never Neverland and doesn't grow up, and he has his nemesis that he fights against, which is Captain Hook. The film of Hook is it's not a sequel. Because what's the opposite of the prequel? It's the sequel. Hook is the sequel to Peter Pan, imagining that Peter Pan decided to come back and grow up, and then Captain Hook comes back and steals Peter Pan's children and takes them back to Neverland to try and get Peter Pan to return to Neverland. Quick synopsis. I'm going to dive into these a little bit because there's loads of archetypes in this movie, and it might indulge your inner child a little bit just to go and watch Peter Pan and Hook. Just watch these. But also the adult part of you that wants to learn about this might be a really helpful way to learn. So Peter Pan is the epitome of the boy archetype. He is the energy of boyhood, but with a wound, with an abandonment wound. Because the story of Peter Pan, which is kind of like explained in Hook, is that he decided, apparently as a tiny baby, which doesn't really make much sense. There's loads of gaps in these stories, but they're stories, right? They're just stories about archetypes. So I'll not pick it apart for all its gaps. But apparently as a tiny baby, Peter Pan decided and made the conscious choice to run away from home and go to Neverland because he didn't want to grow up. But yes, Peter Pan is the wounded child who has abandonment issues that doesn't want to grow up, because when he goes back home, when he decides to go back home and see his family, they've moved on, they've had another child, and he feels abandoned by them. So he decides to stay in Neverland and never, ever, ever grow up. So Peter Pan is the wounded child who avoids responsibility, avoids the process of growing up by staying in Neverland, where we can safely never ever grow up and be a child forever. There, sorry, what's in this flashing light? Might have to do this. Is that going to help? As much as I love to look like angelic. In the Hook story, in the sequel, Peter Pan has actually decided he does want to grow up. He falls in love with Wendy, which was another character I'll break down in a bit, who is in the original Peter Pan film. He falls in love with her granddaughter and decides he wants to grow up and have a family. However, and this is a bit of an important one, what I identified in that movie was that he had never reparented himself. So the theme of Hook is that Peter Pan is a bad dad, that he abandons his children, especially his son. So there's very much this like male energy throughout, really. The females are just supportive characters in this for the most part. But it's about this like wounded boy developing into the father role, essentially. And I'm going, like I say, I'm going to break down all the characters in this because they're all relevant. But in the Hook story, Peter Pan is a bad dad. He's not there for his son. His son is feeling abandoned by his father. And Peter Pan has to go through this process of connecting with his inner child and then reparenting himself so he can embody the father energy and save his son. That's kind of what that process is from the Peter Pan story going into Hook. Now, Captain Hook, a couple key points about Captain Hook is he's an older man and he's in Never Never Land. They're really important to realize. Captain Hook is the archetype of a narcissist. Captain Hook is the archetype of the boy who never ever grew up and is very angry and violent and who wants to kill the inner child. Captain Hook is the arch enemy of Peter Pan. Captain Hook is who Peter Pan will turn into if he didn't go through this process of becoming the father, the role model dad, the embodied adult man. Captain Hook is the adult version of Peter Pan, who is angry, obsessive, who, as is referred to a few times, has never been mothered. Captain Hook, and there's all sorts of themes that go on this. I could go off on one. I'll try not to go too off on one because you might lose the thread. Could have gone off on one. But like I say, if we need more structure to this, I'll put some energy in it and I'll really work it out and figure it all out. But I just kind of want to express it. Captain Hook is chased around by the crocodile, who has swallowed an alarm clock that tick-tock, 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 chases him around and causes him a lot of fear. Captain Hook has a hook because the inner child, Peter Pan, cut off his hand, his functional hand, and fed it to the crocodile, who then chases him around. The crocodile represents death. The crocodile represents this threat of death, this threat of time and aging that is constantly chasing around the unhealed inner child. Captain Hook has been disabled because he hates his inner child, because he hasn't gone through this reparenting process. So the inner child, who is his nemesis in a fight, managed to disable him and cut off his hand, fed it to death, and death now chases him around. So it's about him being wounded by his own fight against his inner child, and then that the time that passes that he is not facing the wound or the inner child and going through the reparenting process just constantly is chasing him around, causing him fear, which then causes his anger, resentment, and obsession. His anger, resentment, and obsession is directed towards Peter Pan, which is the representation of his unhealed inner child. Is that all making sense? Especially if you watch the Hook film, the 3 stages hopefully will explain what I'm trying to get at with this. So Peter Pan is the representation of the wounded boy. Captain Hook is a representation of the wounded boy who doesn't heal, who becomes the narcissist man. And the Peter Pan that grows up in Hook, that goes through this process, connects with his inner child, reparents himself through that process, and then is able to, well, he defeats Hook, by the way. I don't want to spoil the story. He defeats Hook, who disappears then, and he is able to go back and be a good father to his son, therefore ending the cycle. Therefore, Peter Pan does not become Captain Hook, and neither does his son have to go through this process of being either Peter Pan or Captain Hook. Now, there are some other characters involved in this. There are the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is a troop of Peter Pan's companions in Neverland. So they're a group of boys who have never, ever grown up, who've decided they don't want to grow up. Peter Pan is like the leader of them. The Lost Boys are the representation of all the other aspects of our inner child that kind of stay with us until we go through the inner process, the inner healing process, who will all help us fight against this archetypal energy, which is the angry narcissist man. So it's like this war between the children who don't want to grow up with the wounds and the pirates, who are the men who basically didn't heal and are now just really angry and aggressive. Is the story in Neverland of these two kind of camps of the boys and the men. The men are pirates and the boys are the lost boys. Obviously, they're called the Lost Boys. They're lost. They're lost parts of our soul. They're the different wounds of our childhood that are lost in our experience in Neverland that never ever go away until we go through this reparenting process. Again, if you watch the Hook film, when Peter Pan defeats Hook, the Lost Boys, they do stay in Neverland, but they are lost, essentially. They don't have Peter Pan as their leader anymore. They are gone from Peter Pan's life forever. Now, there's the female characters in this story. There's one more male character I want to talk about, actually, which kind of links to the female character, who is only mentioned. There's two. There's the character of Smee. Smee is Smee is Captain Hook's sidekick. Smee is a representation of a beta male, however you want to call it, a codependent male who, again, hasn't gone through his reparenting process and follows around other men. Smee is the representation of a man who hasn't gone to the narcissist route. He's not controlling everything. He is just completely obeying commands. And when he's scared, he can't obey commands, he runs away. Smee is codependent male. It's codependent masculine is Smee. The other male character is Mr. Darling, who is Wendy, who I'll talk about in a minute, Wendy's father. Mr. Darling is a father role who is a parent. So he's only in this a tiny little bit. So it's a tiny little reference to the story. and it links more to the Wendy story really than the Peter Pan story. He's a present father who isn't embodying the father energy, so hasn't fully gone through the process of holding the family. So he's assertive, he's dominant, but he's very passive also. So if, for example, in the Peter Pan story, if you watch the Disney version, Mr. Darling sets boundaries but doesn't follow through. He makes commands and doesn't stick to them. He makes changes and then reverses them. Mr. Darling is the father who plays a role of being a father, but actually hasn't embodied what it means to be a father in that archetypal role. And that's what creates Wendy. So I have to mention that, because all of these characters are all part of this play, essentially. And that's what I'm trying to explain, it, how they feed into it. There's Wendy's two brothers, Peter and Michael, who are in this story, but actually they're not key aspects of the story. They're supportive roles. They do have a place because they represent different phases of boyhood. Michael, who is the youngest, who is the little boy, represents the innocence, the complete beginning, the innocence of boyhood. That's intuitive. He's responsive to his environment, but he's not listened to. He's not respected. So actually, if you watch, Michael has some really great things to say and no one listens. And then the other one, John, am I remember that name correctly? John is a slightly older boy who is playing at being more grown up. John is a boy and he wants to grow up, but he doesn't really, but he's still a child. So he's playing the role of growing up. Much like his father is in this story, Mr. Darling is, if that makes sense, was. Now, moving over to the women. There's only, if I remember correctly, she says 3 women in this film. Well, and in fact, 1 woman, 1 child, and 1 pixie. What's interesting is that she's a pixie in the Disney film, and in the Hook film, she's a fairy. We'll go into that in a minute. That's Tinkerbell. So the women are Mrs. Darling, who is Wendy's mother. And Mrs. Darling represents the nurturing mother role. Mrs. Darling is supposed to be the epitome of motherhood. She is a caring, nurturing, attentive mother. And this is why Michael and John in the story are representing normal, healthy parts of growing up, because they have a mother. And the theme of the mother runs all the way through both of these films, as in, and what's interesting, not the father is not mentioned once really, which I find really interesting. The whole thing is very much about becoming a man and taking on that role of fatherhood and being responsible and all that, but it's not mentioned. But the mother role is mentioned tons. And a lot of the theme is that the reason why the pirates are pirates is because they don't have a mother. The reason why the Lost Boys, why the children who go to Neverland want to come home, is to be reunited with their mother. And the mother in this film is supposed to represent unconditional nurturing love. And that's Mrs. Darling. That's what she represents. There's also the dog, Nana. Just is hilarious, but I was watching, I was like, can you anyway. The dog is raising the kids along with the mother. Who actually she also has an archetype. So she plays, so that Nana is a female role. She's a servant role, so she's caring for the kids, but she's not active. So she's kind of representing women in society, if you like. supportive women around who are supposed to support and nurture the family. You know, as on a edge, peripheral, not directly in your family, but the people who are connected to your family that also support and nurture. And what's interesting about Nana as well is Nana notices what's going on. Nana has a really important part to play, especially at the beginning, because Nana steals Peter Pan's shadow. Now, you hear me talk about shadow work. There's a theme at the beginning of Peter Pan, which is about Peter Pan losing his shadow. Inner child healing is part of shadow work. Peter Pan loses his shadow, and Wendy wakes up when he comes looking for it. Nana took the shadow, right? So Nana seeing the danger of that shadow and took it away, tried to hide it. Wendy found it and then stitched it back on to Peter Pan. So Wendy, who is an important character in this, is representing the reparenting process. She's not Peter Pan's mother. She's not a mother. But through her mothering, through the reparenting that Wendy brings to this story, Peter Pan is reattached with his shadow. Peter Pan is made complete in the Peter Pan story. What's interesting, like I say in Hook, is Peter Pan comes back, Wendy has grown up, and he ends up staying because of Wendy's granddaughter that then created his family. So that's another little bit of a tangent that was just really interesting in it, I thought. But yeah, Wendy is this representation of mothering, reparenting, feminine energy that is part of the reparent process for men, that boys need in order to grow up. So to put this all in a little bit, there's still one more character I'm going to talk about, but to put all this in a little bit of context is that, especially if you're male, if you're a man, we all go through it. But because this is directed at boy energy, boy and men energy, when we realize we need to be reparented, when we realize we have inner child wounds, it takes mothering energy to get through that. The mothering, nurturing, unconditional loving energy has to support this process, and then we embody the father energy. We become the father energy. So in another way of saying it, when we need to be, or when we realize we are vulnerable and we want to go from this child energy into adult energy, it is the feminine energy that we need to heal that allows us to heal our own masculine energy. Is that making sense? Hope it is. I found this all really interesting. Wendy's role in the entire Peter Pan, in the Peter Pan movie, is to go along with Peter Pan. She moves away when she needs to, and she sets boundaries with Peter Pan. She loves him unconditionally. She leaves at times. He abandons her at times when you watch it, but she is always understanding and she is always supportive. She is the one that decides when to go home. She is the one that decides when she's going to be about or not. She is the one that basically tells people what they need. And she is the one that talks a lot about the value of mother, the value of love and care. She even has a little song. Now there's one more female character, like I say, which is Tinkerbell. And Tinkerbell actually is represented as a pixie / then fairy. And Tinkerbell is the representation of the unhealed, unmothered feminine female, the shadow female, the, in today's world, they call it toxic female, the she embodies the negative, the challenging, the hurt female energy. And she's important to this whole story as well, because Tinkerbell is jealous. She is possessive. She is vindictive. But she looks cute. She helps them to fly. There's the flying. I've got to talk about that as well. I'll talk about that in a second. Tinkerbell elevates Peter Pan. She elevates him and wants him to be hers. She follows him around everywhere. She gets really jealous when he's around particularly Wendy. She even tries to kill Wendy. She is not on the side of other females. She is unmothered feminine. She also, in both actually, sorry, I'm getting confused now. In the Peter Pan one, she also betrays Peter Pan and makes an allegiance with Hook, who is the narcissist, in order for a second attempt to try and kill Wendy. So she can have Peter Pan all to herself. Peter Pan is a boy who never grows up. So he is like Smee, who would become Smee and just dote on her and do everything she says. What's interesting then is in the Hook film, it is Tinkerbell who comes and rescues, well, not rescues, comes and takes Peter Pan to rescue his kids back to Neverland and take him through the reparenting process. It is Tinkerbell, it's the toxic female influence on Peter Pan that forces him to go through the reparenting process. And she's the one that guides that, interestingly enough. So he is another one to take, a lesson to take. When we're unhealed, we're going to attract toxic relationships. We're going to attract unbalanced relationships. We're going to attract relationships that aren't necessarily in our best interest. It's this like codependent dynamic. It's those relationships that will actually trigger us to have to deal with our inner child wounds and reparent. And it's those relationships that will guide the reparenting process. So this is a quick interjection. I think that's the right word. Recorded all this and then went about my day and then remembered I've missed out 2 of the characters and I was totally wrong about there only being 3 female characters. There are another 2 archetypes I've missed out, so this is recorded a bit after. I'm going to slot it in this point. It'll all make sense in the end. So the 2 characters I missed are Tiger Lily and the mermaids. So I want to talk for a minute just about them. And please remember that these characters are in Neverland. So they represent inner child wounds. They represent wounds, parts of us that have never ever grown up. And Tiger Lily, this is in the Peter Pan movies. Tiger Lily is in the Peter Pan movies, they fight Indians, Native Americans. This was made in the 50s. And Tiger Lily is kidnapped by Captain Hook in order to try and get Peter Pan out of his hiding place so he can attack him and kill him. So Tiger Lily is a ploy, and that then causes a rift between the Indians, Native Americans, and the Lost Boys, who play this game of capture with each other. And now suddenly the chief gets serious because his daughter Tiger Lily has been captured. Tiger Lily represents the immature female energy, the feminine energy of the vulnerable girl who is helpless, who can't help herself. She's actually very loyal to her father. So Tiger Lily gets captured, but she doesn't give up any information to Peter Pan, to Captain Hook about Peter Pan. Tiger Lily she says nothing throughout the entire film. She does not speak in part. She doesn't say anything. She is just captured. She is the victim, a vulnerable victim. Peter Pan rescues her, and then Peter Pan returns her back to her tribe. And then there's this whole like little storyline of Peter Pan is then honored by the Indians, the Americans tribe, and Tiger Lily then wants to be with him because he's been approved of by her father. So she tries to flirt with him, and you know, he's like her, Peter Pan is like her rescuer now, and she wants to be with him. I mean, the kids, right? So I'm not sexually, I hope, at that point, but that's like the vibe, isn't it? So she represents this the vulnerable, loyal, codependent girl who relies on her father and does what her father says, the good girl. Tiger Lily represents the good girl that Peter Pan rescues, and who she wants to be rescued by that character, that inner child boy, because he is approved of by the father. And then there's also these characters of, and I think what that's representing basically is that when we're going through this phase of toxic relationships in Neverland, when we're not grown up, we will meet these people that make us feel special and important because they are victims, and they're loyal to us because they need us, because they have gone from like their parents who supported and provided for them, and they want someone who's going to keep them safe. So that's what the archetype of Tiger Lily is in the female, in the feminine, in the girl energy. And then there's also these mermaids, and the mermaids are very similar to Tinkerbell, except the mermaids are a bit like the mean girls, right? They represent the idolized feminine. Wendy idolized the mermaids. So at the beginning of the story of Peter Pan, Peter Pan is a story. Wendy tells this story of Peter Pan, the boy who never grows up, to her brothers. And she idolizes the mermaids. So she wants to go to Neverland and meet the mermaids. So the mermaids are Wendy's kind of idyllic version of a beautiful woman living in this place that is perfect. And then when she gets there, like Tinkerbell's a bit more tomboy. She's like with the boys. She's with the lost boys. So she can relate to the boys. And the mermaids represent the unrelatable toxic female, as in like they're beautiful and they're mesmerizing and they flirt with Peter Pan. And what happens is when Peter Pan takes Wendy to meet the mermaids, they're like flirting with him. He forgets about Wendy. He like leaves her. Wendy's all like alone. And then the mermaids start to attack Wendy and try to kill her. And then Peter Pan kind of like helps, and he's like, "Oh, don't worry, it's just a game." Wendy is then like, "Well, they're trying to drown me, they're trying to kill me." And Peter Pan's like, "Oh, it's just a game." Because in Neverland, everything's a game, right? When nobody ever grows up, it's a game. But Wendy nearly gets killed by these women that she idolizes. And I think that representation is where the girl, so Wendy's in Neverland at that point, the girl who herself has this fantasy about life and womanhood, has that fantasy taken away. She meets the reality of the dark side of femininity, that those women have power and they will they're going to be jealous of the person who's taken the affections of their little toy boy, their little plaything boy, and they'll attack her. So that was just like another archetype that I noticed in there with the other female characters of the vulnerable victim in Neverland, who is an inner child wound, and the rebellious, perfect, ego-based goddess style of the feminine that again is an inner child wound that hasn't grown up. Okay, back to the other bit of the video. Does that all make sense? So one more thing I want to mention. This is about the flying. So in Peter Pan can fly. Peter Pan can fly because of the pixie dust that Tinkerbell puts all over him. And the message in Peter Pan about flying is that you have to think happy thoughts. Now, I want to go on a whole spin-off on this about toxic positivity culture. Because the only way they get to Never Never Land is by flying. And flying represents lifting your consciousness, your vibration, elevating above everyone else and going to this place where everything is happy and great. Nobody ever has to grow up, and isn't life perfect? Except it's not perfect, because in Neverland there's this battle between the narcissist and the unhealed inner child. Is that making sense? And the only way you get there is by this sprinkle, sprinkle, sprinkle of pixie dust, which is actually a bit manipulative, which tells you all you've got to do is think happy thoughts and you can fly above everyone else. You never have to grow up. You never have to have any problems. You never have to have responsibility or deal with anything, and just think happy thoughts. It's not true. Well, it is, but you can stay in Never Never Land, but then you'll never grow up, and then you'll turn into Captain Hook, who is a narcissist and horrible. Unless you go through the reparent process, and then you'll become an adult. Ta-da! This is not to say that having happy thoughts is not a good thing and won't elevate you. It's just saying it's not grounded, it's not real, that's not how you grow up. You can't grow up by having only happy thoughts. You have to grow up by facing the reality of your responsibilities. You have to grow up by facing your demons. You have to grow up by taking on the challenges of your relationships. This is what this whole story is about. And I thought this was really interesting. I thought it was perfect representation of what inner child healing is and reparenting. And considering it's in a children's story, if you want to spend, like I did on a Sunday afternoon, just watching these kids' movies, it was just like, yes, I get it. That's why we do reparenting. That's the characters, the archetypes involved. That's the plot. And at the end of it all, so when Peter Pan and Hook goes back home to his real family, they're healed. He can be a father. He can prioritize his family. He can be there for his children. He can be there for his wife. He can meet their needs. Ta-da, that's the happy ending. So that's it. Tell me what you think of this video, please. Let me know in the comments. If you think it needs a little bit more structure and you're like, Terry, this is really interesting, but I couldn't follow all your tangents, please do a proper masterclass or something on it. I'll do that. If you totally get it and you're like, thank you for this representation, that makes the whole thing make a lot more sense. Let me know. If you think I'm talking whole heap of hot, twaddle, let me know as well. There we go. Thank you for watching this video. Let me know what you think. See ya.